Greetings again from Bike Fitness Coaching, where we're going to continue our Bike Fitting 101 series as Part 2. And as we discussed briefly in Part 1, here are some more problems in bike fitting: mechanics versus biomechanics. As we all know as bike fitters, bike fitting is a process of adjusting a bicycle to fit a cyclist, but the terms mechanics about the bike and biomechanics about the body refer to two different aspects of this process. Going through numerous scientific studies, they've investigated the impact of crank arm length on subjective fatigue and cycling. Performance factors such as power output, energy expenditure, oxygen consumption, and breathing. The problem, these studies only look at performance from a purely mechanical point of view, where they should look at from a biomechanical point of view. As an example, if you had a motor turning a crank, if you know how a motor works, every point tangent to the circle, the motor is turning. So it's turning actually in a circle. The body has to make the motion a linear motion to an angular motion. You see the feet going up and down, it's turning a crank around and around. It's not as efficient. So we've already determined that the body biomechanically is not as efficient as a mechanical motor. So let's talk about the relationship between crank length, power output, energy expenditure in cycling, which has been the subject of many scientific studies. The key findings in these studies: power output, negligible impact within the normal range of 145 to 195 millimeter crank arm length. Compensation through increased cadence. The shorter the crank arm, the less force, the higher velocity. The longer the crank arm, the higher the force, the lower the velocity. The power stayed about the same. Energy expenditure and efficiency, i.e. breathing. Oxygen consumption. Shorter cranks may lead to slightly better oxygen uptake. Physiological effects and perceived exertion. Reduced joint load with shorter cranks, i.e. more open hip and knee angles. Reduced fatigue. Negligible change in heart rate. The key takeaways and recommendations: studies focus on power output versus crank length. Focus should be on comfort and injury prevention. In summary, the scientific literature suggests that while crank length may not drastically affect power output, choosing the right crank length for your individual anatomy can contribute to improved comfort, reduced injury risk, and potentially a more efficient pedaling style. To help determine correct crank length, you should see a professional bike fitter, i.e. look for IBFI, International Bike Fitting Institute, Level 4. I hope to drive these points home in the next few slides. Joint measurements. To obtain the perfect bike fit, joint angle measurements must be accurate. So I took a look through Google Images, which shows for saddle height, every fitter does measure the knee angle at 6 o'clock, yet only 1 out of 80, about 1.25%, measured the knee at 12 o'clock, which is the actual position where knee damage occurs. What I found also was 1 out of 20, about 5%, got within 1 inch of correctly finding the mid-leg pivot point, which is the center of the knee. So you can address this in the comments below. Why are these percentages so low? I don't know. For example, going forward, let's see where the center of the knee is. So what are the 3 most important measurements? Well, you can think of the body from the belly button up is all about comfort and control of the bicycle. From the belly button down is where your power is being generated from. So you want to be in safe joint angle ranges. To get this, determine saddle height and crank lengths, we need to know how and where to locate the greater trochanter, the center line of the knee, and the lateral malleolus, which is the ankle bone. The greater trochanter is the top pivot point. It is at the top of the femur, and you can find it by finding a bump as you feel from the femur going up. The next middle pivot is the center of the knee. We'll get into that in a minute. This is actually the hardest measurement to get right, is finding the center line of the knee. Among the easiest is the bottom pivot point, which is the lateral malleolus or the ankle bone. So we go to an x-ray to actually see where the femur and tibia and the center point of the knee is. So right there. In this case, it's right here. And if you'll notice, patella, here's the back of the knee, which is the fleshy muscle part, the hamstrings, top of the calves. You see the joint line is much closer to the front of the knee, i.e. the patella side, than the rear of the knee. Same here. So let's look where the measurements were by a Google Images search. Here was the one I found at 12 o'clock. Yet they're about 2.7 inches or 69, almost 70 millimeters off. Here's the center of the knee, joint line, and here's where they're measuring. This person here at 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock, they're about 2.8 inches off. They're measuring probably close to where the lateral side of the LCL is up here. It's this way off. Even further off, center of the knee, joint line about here, they're measuring toward the back of the knee. 3.5 inches off on this one. They are at the back of the knee. Why are we measuring at such different angles and instances than where the actual center of the knee line is? Here's one I found very interesting. Here is a person showing how to do a bike fit. If you look at, instead of the greater trochanter, they're pointing toward the crotch on the top. Here's the center of the knee, and they're pointing up and back. This arm is pointing toward the heel. And if you look at where their feet are at 3 o'clock. What in the world is this person actually measuring? Our process of measuring the knee angles, and let me state that we use the term max extension. You will also hear that as BDC, or bottom dead center, or 6 o'clock. We like max extension because not everybody is at bottom dead center of the crank or 6 o'clock. They could be slightly ahead or behind that point. So we measure where the leg is actually extended maximally. We set the saddle height to keep the cyclist within generally accepted angle ranges. Then we check the saddle fore aft, and we repeat 1, 2, and 3 until all fall within the same safe ranges. Because remember, as you increase saddle height, it also pushes the rider back. So you need to basically get them recentered by 1, 2, 3 above. Once this is set, now you can measure the knee angle when the leg is at max flexion, or some people call it top dead center, or some people call it 12 o'clock. If there's too much flexion of the knee, then a shorter crank is needed. If a relaxed flexion, then all looks good. Lastly, if a shorter crank is installed, then start back at number 1. At this point, the saddle height should be set correctly. Now, as bike fitters, it is our job to keep learning, stay up to date with the latest technologies and techniques, do no harm, and don't believe everything you hear and read regarding cycling performance in the scientific studies and journals. This is the end of part 2, and stay tuned for part 3, which will get into more of what bike fitting is, bike sizing, etc. Talk to you soon.